day. It's not raining. It's not too cold. I have to say it's just right, I guess. I had was talking to a friend of mine this week, and he taking his wife, and they're going to Hawaii, and they're going on a cruise. He said take them 5 days to get there and 4 days to come back. I don't know how long they're going to stay. But anyway, was thinking about that, and we went one time quite a few years ago, and they got this volcano erupting over there now, and I don't know if you might have listened to the news and seen it. The guy, we took a tour, and went up there on that one island where one of the volcanoes had been. You know, it erupted several years ago. It wasn't active, and I don't know. It's probably 100 foot across it, and just like a big hole in the ground. They had a fence around it. And you look down in there. I don't know how deep it was, and it was just like a pot boiling on a stove where you're boiling something, and it just bubbling. And you walk around that, and there was where that lava had come out of there and run across, and just as black as it could be. You'd think, well, that's really good dirt. That's just like blacktop. And you'd be walking along there, and a puff of steam come out of that. It's weird. And the tour guide would tell you, if you go where, I don't know if it's just that one island or what, but I guess it's whole Hawaii. He says he was so impressed that his Hawaii had grown 98, I think it was 98 acres, something like their land increases. And it had increased 98 acres. I think that's what he told me, something like close to 100 acres. And in Isaiah 5, get the right one here. Isaiah 5:14, it tells us that therefore hell hath enlarged herself and opened her mouth without measure. And I don't know, gives us something to think about. And there's a verse in Isaiah 14 says, hell from beneath is moved. And you just think about that. And but if you ever see it on TV where they show that lava coming out, increasing and everything, and but the scriptures to, I guess, sort of verifying that. And maybe we take that for granted and look at it, but we need to think about it, and it's but hell does enlarge itself. And that tour guide, he was so impressed about how their land grew. Our land don't grow much, but 100 acres is quite a bit, a pretty good little piece of land. Grew that much, but it gives you something to think about. You don't want to think about hell too much, but we think about it, we don't want to go there, and think about, what prevents us from going there, and but we need to think more about the Lord, and think more about salvation, and teaching and telling others about God. I don't know who all's on the prayer list, but we know each and every one of them. Had a neighbor that passed away yesterday, and Chandler, Kenneth Chandler, I don't know if somebody might, I don't know, you might have knew him, I don't know. He used to be a troubleshooter for the REA, and, anyway, they lived pretty close. But remember that family, and, remember others that's on our prayer list here, and, especially during Christmas and all this, time of year that there's more, suicides, things like that. People get more depressed around Christmas, and, should be a happy time, and lots of times it's not. But, we do remember those people like that, and remember the people in the rest homes and things, and, just remember our neighbors, remember each other. So, let's stand, be dismissed their classes, and, Joey, you want to dismiss us, please?
All right, it's good to be in the Lord's house. You have to get me a Christmas tie like Brother Charles. It's a hint to my kids in case they haven't, think of anything to get me yet. Get me a Christmas tie. At any rate, we are in Exodus chapter 20. And we're going to be spending the next few weeks here in this chapter because this is one of the most important chapters in the Bible. And so we're going to get into it today and kind of do a little overview. But Exodus chapter 20, this will be the introduction if you were in the, I don't know what chapter this is in the notes, but it's called the Introduction to the Ten Commandments. We'll begin by reading. Let's at least read the first few verses here of chapter 20. It says, And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which hath brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. Now we'll stop there because we're not going to get that far, even that far today. But we are going to be, like as I said, for the next few weeks we'll be going through these. And if you recall from last week, we are still in this awesome moment. If you remember, the children of Israel have come up to the mountain. God is on the top of the mountain, and Moses was called up to meet him. The entire mountain, there was an earthquake going on. Apparently, the entire top of the mountain looked like it was on fire, and there was a loud, apparently it was so loud, we're going to see later on that the children of Israel actually move away from the mountain here at the end of chapter 20, and it's going to be a few weeks before we get to that, but we're going to see that they actually retreated even from the boundaries that were set. They weren't allowed to go up on the mountain. There were boundaries set, and they actually retreated because there was such a loud sound of trumpets playing, and God was speaking, and they could hear God speaking to Moses. And so we're right here in the middle of this awesome scene, this God meeting man. And as we said last week, the realization, I think that these Israelites had, that to face God on their own, how terrifying that was, how truly awesome this moment was. And we see that God has come down in power. He's shown himself, and he's not even showing his full glory. Obviously, even we'll see later on, even Moses was not able to see the full glory of God. But he has come down and he's revealed enough of himself to where the people are truly terrified. This moment they are in, they find themselves in, they realize that it is way beyond their capability to even stand there before the Lord, even to stand at the bottom of the mountain. And so God has come down in power. He is showing just a little bit of himself to the people. And then there in the beginning here of chapter 20, God actually speaks with an audible voice and begins to speak to Moses. And we see we just read the beginning of that, what God said, recorded there. And these are the 10 Commandments. And the children of Israel can hear what God is saying. They can hear his voice, hear what he's saying to Moses. And I think this right here, as I already said, this is one of the great chapters in the Bible. And so we definitely want to take our time in this chapter because, you might say, oh, aren't all the chapters great? Isn't the whole Bible great? And of course it is. But this one in particular sets the tone for really the rest of the entire Bible, especially the rest of the Old Testament. The entire rest of the Old Testament is going to be God dealing with the children of Israel, judging them when they break these commandments, and judging them when they disobey his commandments, and then also praising them and blessing them when they do follow him. And we're going to see that the entire rest of the Old Testament, and even in the New Testament, a lot of what Jesus did, a lot of what Jesus said was explaining the Old Testament, explaining what the commandments were all about. And so this right here is probably, excuse me today, my voice is going. This chapter in particular is what the whole rest of the Bible pivots on. It's what everybody looked, even Jesus, when he was here in his earthly ministry, was looking back on this. And in the Sermon on the Mount, we'll get into that later, he was explaining what the commandments were all about, how you can really, truly serve God and how you can truly obey God's commandments. And so this right here is by far, this chapter is so instrumental to everything that we believe, everything as Christians that we believe, and also too it helps to explain the entire Old Testament. So we're going to definitely spend some time here in this chapter. And I think here we see for the first time truly what God expects from man. And this whole scene, this earthquake, the mountain on fire, the blaring trumpets, this displaying God's power and showing just how powerful God is. And all this is going on as he's delivering these 10 Commandments. So if they could hear exactly what was being said, even above all that, I don't know if they could actually hear the actual words or if they could just hear that God was speaking. But all of this going on while God is delivering the law just shows us just how powerful God is. And also, too, I think it was showing to them, and it shows to us as we try to paint this scene, as we try to think of what was really going on here. It shows us that God has the authority to establish these laws, the laws that God established for our lives, for their lives back then, but this has always been true. These are, particularly, we're going to look at these commandments, and we're going to see there's so much in the rest of this book, so many laws, and some of them are ceremonial, some of them were laws that pertain to the Israelites, and we don't have to follow those laws. We don't, as Christians, as believers in Jesus, we're not under that old covenant completely. But what we're going to see is that here in these 10 commandments, these are 10 basic commandments that are, even though there's only 10, it is all encompassing. We're going to see that it covers every part of our lives, how we deal with God and how we deal with each other. And I think this display of God's power is to show that God does have the authority to establish these rules. These are his rules, and he has the authority to establish them for life and for living. And so today we're going to lay some groundwork for this so that we can really study these commandments, each one particularly a little more in depth, and kind of understand that some of them are only 2 words. They're 3 words, thou shalt not kill. But there's so much more in that does not just simply cover murder. So today we're going to just look at the basics. I don't know if you guys have been looking through the study guide, but we're going to kind of go through the study guide and look at this, particularly what the word law means in its various shades of meaning in the Bible. And we're going to look at a couple of verses here. I'm not going to make you turn too much, but the law of God, when that phrase is used multiple times in the Word of God, and it can mean many different things in the Bible. And so we're going to look at a few of those. There's 5 in particular, 5 different kind of shades of meaning that it can mean when you see that in the Bible. And the first one is, in particular, is for this law of Moses, this first 5 books of the Bible called the Pentateuch. And sometimes when Jesus, particularly when he would talk about the law, he would be talking about the law of Moses, or these first 5 books. And you don't have to turn there, but in John 1:17, John wrote, it says, "For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ." So we see here in that in that setting, he was talking about the law of Moses, these first 5 books, and particularly what we're going to be studying here through the rest of Exodus, and even if we went on into Leviticus and Numbers, there's so much to that law, and that's what John was referring to. But then also, too, sometimes the law can refer to the entire Word of God, and I think of Psalms chapter 1, Psalms 1, 1, and 2, and I was going to quote it because I was made to memorize that when I was in school, and I thought I had it in my mind, but I'm going to make sure I don't mess it up, so I'll turn it real fast. But Psalms chapter 1, David says, "Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night." So we see sometimes, in this particular instance, when King David was writing this, the law is referring to the entire Word of God. Everything that God has written is precepts that we can learn from. Every part of it is important. Every part of it we can learn something from, we can garner information from, and we can learn how to serve God better through even, you think about all the examples, the judges, and when you read through there in the life of David and all these, there's so much we can learn from every part of the law. And so sometimes the law refers to the entire Word of God. And then also, though, too, sometimes the word law is used just to describe the civil law, and that we're going to get into later on here in Exodus. And so I was listening to somebody this week, and they said that there were 613, that somebody went through and counted them all. And through the rest of Exodus and into Leviticus and Numbers, there were 613 laws that God gave the children of Israel, and that those 613 can be summed up in these 10 that we're going to be studying. These first 10, the 10 Commandments, covers all these, but there were 613 individual specific laws that God gave them. And so sometimes the word law can refer to that a lot of that's going to be civil law. It's going to be things about if you accidentally injure someone else, or if you kill someone else's animal, or just all these different instances of different situations that could happen, and there's going to be a lot of those civil laws. And so sometimes, and particularly in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 1, I think the writer of Hebrews, and I'll turn there real fast, I hate to turn too much, but I think these verses are important. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 1, it says, "For the law, having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image." So you can see he's talking about the ceremonial law, because the ceremonial law that we're going to get into later was more about types. So a lot of the sacrifices, they typified Christ and what he was going to come and do. So here he's talking about these shadows of these old types of the old civil law that God gave them, and the ceremonial law, the different washings, the different cleansings, the different sacrifices they were supposed to bring. So he says there, the law having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of the things, can never, with those sacrifices, which they offered year by year, continually make the comers thereunto perfect. So what he's saying there is, these things were a type of Christ. Christ is the one that makes us perfect. His sacrifice, we can be perfect in his sacrifice. But back then, all these old ceremonial laws, they were just types. They were pictures that pointed us to Christ, that they were supposed to point the people back then and help them to realize that there was a Savior who was coming. And so we see here in this instance, in Hebrews chapter 10, and some other places in Hebrews as well, that when the word law is used, he's talking about the ceremonial law. And then also, we're going to see that it can not only be the ceremonial law, but also the civil laws that we just talked about also too, especially right after we get done with Exodus 20 and 21, we're going to get into chapter 22, and even in chapter 22, there's going to be so many of these civil laws, things that deal with the interactions between people, and even as today, what we would call civil law. You know, there's a difference between laws that you can, obviously, if you murder someone or something, you have capital crimes like that. They are usually, the state takes care of arresting those people and also trying to punish them and seeking to convict them in court. But then there's also civil, there can be civil suits where it's one person against another, and when you maybe have a problem with your neighbor. And so we're going to see that the law also too, many times can pertain to that. And we're going to see in Exodus, beginning in chapter 22, that whenever it's referring to the law, he's talking about this civil law that they had. And so then moving on from there, though, we have these 10 Commandments, or what a lot of people have called the moral law. And it is we're going to see that the ceremonial law could be done away with, but this standard of right and wrong is useful at all times in our lives. It's relevant through every generation. This has never changed. You think about how long ago God gave this law to the children of Israel, and it has never changed. It has always been useful. It has always been relevant. Every generation needs it, and whether our generation realizes it or not, it is the best way to live. If you look out in this world and you see the way people are living and how they've messed their lives up, and a lot of it is simply because they do not believe these 10 Commandments. And maybe I'm getting the cart before the horse, but I think we're all pretty well aware of what the commandments are. And our entire society is in shambles in many ways. The family is destroyed, and so much of the way life used to be, even when I was young, 40 plus years ago, is just you feel like it's just been destroyed. And it's mainly even because people do not realize how useful and relevant these commandments are. And if people lived their lives this way, lived their lives by these simple 10 Commandments, our society, our lives would be so much better, even independent of the fact that, I'm not talking about even in the fact that obviously people need to be saved and God's saving grace. I'm just talking about a standard for living. And we see that here. This is absolutely useful, absolutely relevant to every last one of us. And so we see here, so it can mean all 5 of these different things. And sometimes it means just the 10 Commandments. Sometimes it means the entire Pentateuch. But we see that the word law in the Bible is used with various shades of meaning, but it basically generally refers to some part of the law, these words that God gave particularly to Moses. All right, so moving on. And also, too, just before we get in, we're going to look at some of the implications of this law, the implications of the law, but also, to a degree, this knowledge of right and wrong is implanted by God in every person. It is in every person's conscience. And I have here Romans 2, verses 14 and 15, and we won't turn there, but even there, Paul talks about that even it doesn't matter where you go, even the people who have never heard of Jesus, they have a conscience, and they have laws that are imprinted. They know that certain things are right and wrong, and they know those things because they judge each other. When you judge somebody else and you see somebody doing something that is hurtful or mean, and you look at them and you judge them and say they should not be doing those things, you are admitting that there is a law, that's in your own heart, that's in your own conscience, and God put that there. And then when you go and do the same thing, the same things that they do, you have essentially judged yourself. And so there is a knowledge of right and wrong that God has given every person. And even though I think anytime people set out to sin, we easily suspend. It's so easy to suspend your conscience, to just kind of brush it aside when you really are being willful and you want to do something, even though you know it might not be the best thing to do, or you might understand that it's flat out wrong. Yet we are so easily able to suspend that conscience and look at ourselves differently than we look at others. But just the fact that we judge other people helps us to understand that there is a knowledge of right and wrong in every one of us. And our consciences can find that excuse to sin very easily. It doesn't take much of an excuse for us to feel like we can justify the things that we do. And yet, we're always also quick to judge other people. I think we're very quick to judge other people. And so even in that, when you judge other people, you are admitting that there is this knowledge of right and wrong. Basically, maybe not the commandment spelled out, but in some ways, yes, it is. If we understand the 10 Commandments I guess I should say it like this, the 10 Commandments, when you really read them, they make a lot of sense. And it's because that law is already written in your heart. It's already in your conscience. The Lord, when he created you, he made each of us in his image. And so we already have a basic understanding that these things are true. And moving on, though, into the implication, there's implications also, and we're kind of already getting into that, but the implications of the law. And this kind of ties into what I was just saying, but the very existence of laws, the very existence even of man-made laws, the fact that in our society, we understand, every society has always understood that we need to have certain laws, certain things that help society to work. And so even man-made laws have implications that help us understand that there is a lawgiver, that there's one, that there is those laws written in our heart. And that's first and foremost. When any person who understands that there has to be laws in society, that there has to be man-made laws, and obviously we have the law of God, first and foremost, when you believe in law, it also requires a belief in a lawgiver. And I think that that's where so many people in our society, so many people have left this idea of God. No, people have rejected the idea of God, and when you reject the idea of God, it makes the laws that we have make no sense. Because if there is no God and there's no law, then there is really no moral absolutes, or I guess I should say, where do moral absolutes come from? How do you believe in anything if you reject God? And that is the problem with the atheist. I think the atheist would like to pick and choose. Most atheists would not ever just come out and say that there is no law, that there is nothing, and even if they do, they don't live their lives that way. And yet, the atheists would like to pick and choose what laws that they would like to have and which ones they wouldn't. But we don't have that luxury. I was thinking, there was a kid, it was like 10 or 11 years ago now, I worked at FedEx, and there was this kid, and I've talked about him before. We would talk every night for a couple hours in this trailer while we were loading and unloading all this stuff. And he was really interesting, and he would talk about his mom would make him go to Catholic church, so I thought he was at least remotely religious, but come to find out, he was a staunch evolutionist. He did not even believe in God. He absolutely would just look you in the face and say, I do not believe that there is any God out there anywhere. And it was always so interesting because we had conversations over weeks and weeks, and so not every night. But after all the times that we talked about religion, I would talk about my faith, then we would talk about evolution and just how in the world you could believe all this came from nothing, and just all those conversations. One of the last things he ever said to me was, because he didn't want me to think he was, I guess he thought I was maybe judging him, and one of the last things he ever said to me was, after all the other stuff he said, but I do good things. He said that to me. He said, I do good things. And I asked him, how do you know it's good? How do you know what's good and what's not? And he was telling me some of the stuff that he had done to help people and things like that. And the question, though, is to the atheist, how do you know what's good? If there are no laws and there is no lawgiver, then how do you ever decide what is good? And there again, that is the law written in our hearts. We understand that there is right and there is wrong. And one of the implications of that, just understanding that there is truly things that are wrong in this world that you could do and truly things that are right, is enough to imply that there is a lawgiver. There is one who has made the rules, has the authority to enforce those rules, and if you are an atheist, you would have to truly believe that there is no difference between going out and feeding the homeless and helping at a homeless shelter or murdering somebody. Both are activities both of them are activities that would have the same, they would both be equal. I mean, you could go out on a Saturday and feed the homeless, or you could go out on a murdering spree. And what would be the difference if you truly believe that there is no God, that there is no lawgiver? Then you have to concede that there really is no way to know that you have ever done anything that's good, because how would you judge these things? And how would you know what is right and wrong? And so, but because of the implications, because of this law, because we believe in God, then there are some implications that there are some things that are definitely right and there are some things that are definitely wrong. And if there was no God, there would be no lawgiver. But there is, and we know that. And we know it in our hearts. We know it from God's word. And those are things that every person can know. Every person can know. If you are sane enough and able enough of mind to understand that there is right and wrong, then you know that there is a lawgiver, that there are things that are right and wrong, and that there is a God, because he is the lawgiver, and he has put those things in our hearts. Then the real problem, though, with atheists and those who would be either agnostics or not really believe in God, or not really believe in God the way we believe that God works and exists and works in our world, even in our lives, in our hearts. One of the real problems is that if you do recognize that God is the lawgiver, if you are forced to look at these 10 commandments that we're going to study and realize that they are from God, that he is the lawgiver, then you have to view him not only as the creator, because if he has the authority to give us these laws, then he obviously is the one who created us. And then also, you have to view him as the sovereign over our world. And there are very few people today that will recognize that God is sovereign, or that God really is truly the king of this world. And so that's another reason. That's why it's another problem, especially for those who do not want to believe in God. Because if you recognize any of these laws, you have to recognize him as creator and as the sovereign over this world. And then you have to recognize he does have that authority. He has the authority to tell you that you should live this way. And most people do not want to admit that. Most people do not want to be bound by that. And they do not want to admit that there is truly right and wrong. And also, too, another thing before we move on, if there really is truly right and wrong, if there really is a law that has been given by a sovereign king who created you, then there's also a certainty that someday there will be judgment for these things. If you break these laws, if you ignore these laws, then certainly there will be a judgment someday. And that's another thing. People are not willing, and especially in our society, more and more people are not willing to admit they don't want to start. That's why they don't follow the Ten Commandments. That's why they do not follow God's law, because then they would have to admit these other things, that God is creator, that he is sovereign, and that one day he will judge the world. And so these are all implications of the law, and that's why you see in our society more and more lawlessness. Every day you see, and it just seems like every day there's more and more crime on the local news and national, all around the world. Just people who are absolutely lawless, who do not have any fear of God, and it's because they do not believe that they need to live by these Ten Commandments. Because to do that, they would have to admit all these other things about God, and especially that there is a certainty of judgment one day for all those who would break God's laws. And then going on, just a few other little things here before we'll get into the commandments next week. But a couple of things that the law reveals about God. First of all, they reveal his perfect holy nature. And I think it's interesting, the fact that love defines, and I know I'm getting the cart before the horse, we haven't even studied this yet, but we're going to see that love is the one defining thing of the entire Ten Commandments. All these commandments, and most of them are given to us in a negative way. Thou shalt not, and they seem negative, and they are. These things that you absolutely cannot do. But when you really start looking at them, and we're going to see later on, that the entire Ten Commandments are grounded in love. If you love your neighbor, and if you love God with all your heart, that fulfills the entire law. And so we see here just the fact that even the commandments that God has given us are meant to help us live like him, meant to be more like him. And in our situation, now that we have seen the example of Christ, it's meant to allow us to live more like Christ. And in that way, love is the fulfilling of the law. And so we see here in this that God is love, that his perfect holy nature is, even though he is just, and we know all these things, that his perfect holy nature can truly really be summed up in that God is love. And I think these commandments, as we see them, and we see just how living by them fulfills the law of love toward each other and toward God particularly, we're going to see that it shows how good God is. God is love, and he is good, and we see his perfect holy nature revealed in these commandments. And also, too, the Ten Commandments, I think, prove the infinite nature of God. We're going to see, as we get into these commandments, each one of them is like a heading over a particular set of sins, or in the instance of the ones that talk about how we should love God and worship God. Each one is a small snippet of a huge, just like the tip of an iceberg. We're going to see each one of these commandments represents so much more than just one simple thou shalt not. There's so much that goes into each one of these commandments. And I think it's interesting that as we see this, we're going to see that a lot of the sins that we commit, others do not see. It's the tip of an iceberg. People can see the tip of the iceberg, but we're going to see that God sees the entire thing. God sees our hearts, and God sees our minds, and we're going to see that a lot of the sins that are covered by the Ten Commandments are secret sins, sins of the mind, sins of the heart, things that other people may not know about us. And just the fact that even God, when given these commandments, he, and especially particularly the last commandment, thou shalt not covet, that entire commandment is something that goes on in your heart. People cannot necessarily see you coveting. There's no unless you are actively, sometimes if people are actively going out to, obviously if somebody steals something from somebody else, we can recognize that initially they had to covet that item, or they would never have tried to steal it. But covetousness is one of those things that is in our hearts and minds that other people don't necessarily see, but we see here that God does. He has an infinite nature, and in these commandments we're going to see that not only does he is he judging the things that that are obvious and apparent that everybody can see, but a lot of these sins are sins of the heart and sins of the mind. And so we see here in this that God has this infinite nature, and he is able to judge not only our actions, but he's able to judge the heart. And also too, as we said before, judgment is certain. God someday will bring every offender to justice. And if you're here and you're saved, we have a day of reckoning. One day we are going to stand before the Lord, and we are going to be judged for our thoughts and our actions, and we're going to be judged by these commandments. And if you're here and you're lost, you will not escape God's justice either. One day you will stand before the Lord, and you will be judged on these 10 commandments and everything that they entailed. And that is a certainty. There is a certainty of justice just in the very fact that you understand in your heart that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. It's enough for you to know that there is a lawgiver. There's one who decreed these laws. They are the best possible way to live. The best way and the most perfect way you can live your life is to adhere to these laws that we're going to study over the next few weeks. And there is a lawgiver. There is a sovereign, and you will not escape God's justice. If you're here and you're lost someday, when you stand before the Lord, you will not escape the justice of God. He knows everything, and we're going to see in the infinite nature of God. He knows your heart, not just your actions, but your heart. And so that is the introduction, and we will begin next week getting into each one of these commandments and studying each one more particularly. But thank you for your attention.